This video is the last video in our communication series looking at the brain. So the 2 dot points we're going to start off with are identify those areas of the cerebrum involved in the perception and interpretation of light and sound, and perform a first-hand investigation to examine an appropriate mammalian brain, in our case the sheep's brain, or a model of a human brain to gather information to distinguish the cerebrum, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata, and locate the regions involved in speech, sight, and sound perception. Then we'll be having a look at what happens when messages aren't sent and the brain's not working properly. So firstly, we're going to have a look at the structures and the functions of the brain in general. We will then be having a look at identifying the different regions that are involved specifically in the interpretation of light and sound. In your booklet, you have a copy of this diagram. So what we're going to do is go through it now in the video, and you can add your notes yourself at home. So number 1 is the frontal lobe. So this is the front top region of the brain on both sides of the middle. So if we were to draw a line down the middle of our skull from the front to the back and divide it in half on the left and the right, we have 2 hemispheres. So we have the frontal lobe on the left and the right hemisphere at the front of our head behind our forehead. This area of the brain is involved in reasoning, emotions, judgment, and voluntary movement. Number 2 is the pituitary gland. This is a small gland that is attached to the base of the brain, and its job is to release different hormones. Number 3 is the temporal lobe. So this is the region at the lower side of each hemisphere, and you can feel it between your eye and your ear. So this area is involved in hearing and memory, and it's an area that can sometimes be affected if you get a blow to the side of the head. Number 4 is the pons, which is part of the brain stem that joins the 2 sides of the brain together and then connects the cerebrum, which is the main mass of the brain, with the cerebellum, which is this part here, and it's located just above the medulla oblongata. So that brings us to number 5, which is the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest section of the brain stem before it becomes the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata is involved in automatic functions, including heartbeat and breathing. And what can actually happen with people that have swelling of the brain due to fluid buildup, etc., the medulla oblongata sits just inside our skull at the back of our head. And if the brain swells, what actually can happen is this part will be pushed through the small opening of the skull and can actually cause people to die as a result. An example being Anna Wood, who was a young girl who had an adverse reaction to some ecstasy tablets, caused her brain to swell, and basically she died. She just stopped breathing and her heart stopped because the swelling caused her medulla oblongata to be pushed out through the hole in her skull and basically stopped functioning properly. Number 6 is the spinal cord, which is a thick bundle of nerve fibers that run from the base of the brain to the top of the hip and is housed within the vertebral column. Next, we have the cerebellum, which is this round bulbous part here. So it's a part of the brain below the back of the cerebrum, and its job is to regulate posture, movement, balance, movement, and coordination. I said movement twice, just so you know. So sometimes when you get a blow to the back of the head, that's why you can be dizzy and uncoordinated, because that area is slightly impaired. Next, we have the occipital lobe, which is directly at the back of the head. And again, there is one on both sides of the brain, and this area is involved with vision and reading ability. Again, a blow to the back of the head can cause blurred vision because that area of the brain is affected. Number 9 is the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of nerve fibers that connect the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And when we do our brain dissection in class, you will see that it actually does have this C-shape structure. And lastly, number 10 is the parietal lobe. So this is the middle lobe of the brain between the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe. Again, one on each side of the brain, and it contains a number of important sensory sensors. The brains of humans appear to be out of proportion in comparison with the overall body size. This is due to the great enlargement of the cerebrum, which I said is this main part of the brain here. The cerebrum splits into 2 hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere. Each of the hemispheres receives impulses from and exerts control over the opposite side of the body. So as we can see here, the left hemisphere actually controls our right hand, and our right hemisphere controls our left hand. So what actually happens in the brain is there's quite a bit of crossing over of information across the two different hemispheres. The hemispheres in turn are then divided into 5 lobes, being the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, the temporal, and one that's not on this picture is the insular lobe. So the 4 that we need to focus on are these 4 that are in this image. And basically in our brain, we have a left and right frontal, a left and right parietal, a left and right occipital, and a left and right temporal. So in all, we have 8 in total of these different lobes. So under a tough protective coating, which is known as the Dura Mater, the surface of the cerebrum is drawn up into folds called convolutions, which helps to triple the surface area of the brain. Most of the activities of the cerebrum occur in its outer surface, in a layer of grey matter, which is only a few millimeters thick. Those activities fit 3 general categories: motor or movement, sensory involving the senses, and associative. The associative cortex makes up about 95% of the cerebral cortex and is the site of higher mental activities such as reasoning and logic. So the optic nerve, the optic nerves are the sensory nerves involved in vision. So fibers arise from the retina of the eye to form the optic nerve, which we looked at in detail when we looked at the retina. Each optic nerve passes through the skull via an opening in the eye socket towards the back. The optic nerve from each eye then partly crosses over to form the optic chiasma. So chiasma just simply means crossing over. About half of the nerves cross to the other side, providing each visual cortex in the brain with the same image as viewed by both eyes, but each eye receives the image from a slightly different angle. So this comes back and helping us with our depth perception that we looked at earlier in the topic. The visual cortex lies within the occipital lobe for each of the cerebral hemispheres. Impulses are received from the retina via the optic nerve, and different sites on the visual cortex process information from different positions in the retina. So the easy way to remember where the optic nerve is interpreted is to remember that optic and occipital both start with O. So the auditory nerves arise from the hearing apparatus within the ear, which we know as being the cochlea. We've looked at this in quite a bit of detail. So the nerve fibers that come out of the cochlea merge to form the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is more commonly known as the auditory nerve. So this nerve runs from the organ of Corti to the auditory cortex in the brain, which is found in the temporal lobe. An auditory cortex is found in the temporal lobe, both again on the left and the right-hand side of the brain, so in both hemispheres, and different sites on the cortex receive and interpret different sound frequencies. So just like the different areas of the occipital lobe receive different areas from different parts of the retina, different areas of the temporal lobe interpret different sound frequencies. So for this particular dot point, we only need to be able to identify the regions that are involved in sight and sound detection, which we've seen as the occipital lobe for vision and the temporal lobe for sound. So when we do the brain dissection in class, we'll also be looking at the areas that are involved in the creation of speech, and which brings us to looking at all the 3 things that we have looked at throughout the topic and how the brain functions in being able to perceive and interpret those messages. Lastly, the very last dot point that we need to look at for HSC biology is explain using specific examples the importance of the correct interpretation of sensory signals by the brain for the coordination of animal behaviour. So up until now, we've been looking at how we create sound, how we perceive sound, how we perceive images. So what we need to do is just have a look at what happens when these messages aren't sent to the brain properly, or if the brain itself is unable to interpret them properly. So in order for us to be able to interpret what's going on around us, to be able to behave appropriately, we need stimuli to come in from the environment. So stimuli must be received and transmitted to the brain or spinal cord before being interpreted and a response given. A variety of reasons can cause what we call a short circuit in the brain, just like we used our analogy of the nerves being like a power cord. We can look at problems with the brain being like a short circuit in a power cord. So some of these could include, firstly, a lack of stimulus. So for example, the cataracts that are the clouding of the eye due to the clumping together of the proteins stops the light from actually reaching the retina. And blockages of the ear canal, such as by earwax, can actually stop the vibrations from reaching the eardrum. Trauma, such as the severing or damage of the nerves by cutting or a concussion as the result of being hitting the head, can also cause a disturbance in brain function. The lack of oxygen by asphyxiation or being choked, suffering a stroke where there's an embolism in the brain which stops oxygen from getting to a certain part of the brain, drowning, which obviously stops the oxygen from coming into the lungs and therefore stops it being able to be diffused into the blood and sent around the body. Also, the lack of oxygen during childbirth can also cause a large number of issues later in life, such as cerebral palsy, and we'll be having a look at that a little bit later. Illegal or legal drug reactions, such as alcohol, anesthetic, or sedatives. Obviously, anesthetic and sedatives have a short-term effect on the brain. However, overuse of these things, and alcohol in particular, can cause long-term problems when it comes to the brain and the interpretation of messages. Disease, so pathological or infectious diseases, genetic diseases that are passed from generation to generation. Congenital diseases, so those that individuals are born with, or autoimmune diseases where the body's own immune system attacks their own cells. Pollution, so we've looked at noise pollution a few times in relation to the ear and how that can damage the way that the message is interpreted. We can also have pollution such as chemicals, including lead and Agent Orange, which can cause interruptions to the nervous signals. And lastly, age-related damage and deterioration. So obviously, over time, the nerve cells, the brain cells, they start to break down and they're not being regenerated. So we're going to have a look at a few specific examples of different problems that happen here. So different short circuits, what causes them, and some symptoms that could result. So firstly, multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease in which there is an immune attack by the body on its own cells, in particular, the myelin sheath. So gradually the myelin sheath in the central nervous system is destroyed and become hard substances known as scleroses, which is obviously where we get the name multiple sclerosis. As the insulating layer of the axon or the nerve fibers becomes non-functional, the impulses are short-circuited and finally conduction of the impulse ceases. So what happens is these scarred tissues stop the nervous impulse from traveling along, and obviously then messages aren't getting to the muscles. So some common symptoms of multiple sclerosis is problem controlling your muscles. So you can have weakness, clumsiness, incontinence where you can't control your bladder, and also visual disturbances. So problems relating to alcohol, anesthetics, and sedatives. So these can all impair the transmission of messages. So they can break down the barrier or create barriers between the message getting sent from the stimuli to the brain or from the brain to our effectors. So they block all nerve impulses by reducing the plasma membrane's permeability to sodium ions. So you'll recall when we looked at the action potential, if the sodium cannot move across the membrane, then we have no action potential resulting. And we know that from the syllabus dot point, there's either a full action potential to create a nervous impulse or there's none at all. There's no sort of in between. So some common symptoms that can be related to the use of alcohol, anesthetic, and sedatives is poor coordination, lack of concentration, slowed reflexes, tiredness, blurred vision, and slurred speech, simply because the messages are getting through, but they're just not getting through as fast as they should, so the body's not able to adapt to the environment or be able to react as quickly. So cerebral palsy was one we mentioned earlier. So cerebral palsy may be caused by a temporary lack of oxygen to a baby during a difficult delivery. So one big thing that doctors will monitor during childbirth is to make sure that things like the umbilical cord is not wrapped around the baby's neck, because otherwise, obviously, that can lead to asphyxiation and stop the oxygen from getting to the brain. Also, between the time that the baby leaves the womb and comes out into sort of the world, there can also be a lack of oxygen through the birth canal. So doctors need to make sure that there's ample oxygen, that delivery occurs quickly. Otherwise, things like a cesarean may need to take place in order to speed things up. So cerebral palsy, is a neuromuscular damage. So in this case, voluntary muscles lack coordination due to brain cells. So the heart still functions properly, the lungs still function properly, etc. But the muscles that are involved in voluntary actions lack coordination. So the brain cells are unable to transmit a message to the muscles, and as a result, the muscles cannot be controlled voluntarily. So some common symptoms include impairments to movement. So a lot of the time, it also depends on the severity of the cerebral palsy due to different levels of oxygen being not present during childbirth. So it can be from mild cerebral palsy where people can still walk and talk and things like that, through to severe cerebral palsy, a bit like our image here, where the individual has lost almost all of the voluntary functions of their body. The next disease is neurofibromatosis, which can be classified into two distinct types, so NF1 and NF2. So both of these are genetic disorders which cause tumours to grow along the various types of nerves. So as we can see in this picture here, all of these little bulbous type structures on the surface of the skin are actually tumours that are growing along the nerves. So Neurofibromatosis One, or known as Recklinghausen's disease, occurs in 1 in 4,000 births. Some common symptoms include multiple coffee-coloured birthmarks and tumours on or under the skin. Tumours may develop on the brain and spinal cord, and up to 50% of people with this disease will have learning difficulties. So Neurofibromatosis 2, also known as bilateral acoustic neurofibromatosis, is much rarer and occurs in 1 in 40,000 births. Some common symptoms include hearing loss, occurring in teens, which is generally the first symptom due to tumours affecting the auditory nerve. NF2 is also categorized by multiple tumours on the nerves of the brain and spinal cord. Next, we have rubella, which we get vaccinated for, especially females, because you definitely don't want to catch the rubella virus while you are pregnant, as it can cause major issues for your unborn child, which we'll be having a look at in a second. So rubella is also known as German measles and is caused by the rubella virus. The disease causes a fine rash, as we can see here, which is quite red and nasty, fever, and sometimes an upper respiratory tract infection, but no more trouble than the common cold. So normally, catching German measles isn't such a bad thing. However, if a woman contracts rubella in the first 3 months of pregnancy, the virus may pass through the placenta to the developing baby. Damage to the brain and spinal cord leads to a lack of transmission of nerve signals to various organs. The baby could then be affected by what's known as rubella congenital syndrome. Some common symptoms include high rubella antibody levels combined with any or all of the following symptoms. So cataracts, congenital glaucoma, and retinopathy of the eye, which obviously all affect the visual perception. Loss of hearing because of damage to the the nerve receptors in the ear, congenital heart disease, as well as problems with the development of the brain, spinal cord, spleen, liver, and possibly the bones. So obviously rubella is an easy disease to avoid using vaccination, but again, because so many people are avoiding vaccinations, we are seeing German measles pop up every now and then. Lastly, age-related damage or deterioration. So the human brain reaches its maximum size in young adulthood. So about now, your brain is in the process of reaching its full growth. From then on, the neurons may be damaged and die due to different things, including some of the things we've looked at, such as suffering from a blunt force trauma, the excessive use of drugs and alcohol, which can damage the cells in the brain. Unfortunately, these neurons are unable to repair themselves and unable to replace themselves. So what actually happens is we have a gradual loss of weight and volume to the brain, as we can see here. So this is a nice, healthy, fully grown brain. And then here we have a deterioration in brain size, and we can see that there's visible differences between the structures of the young brain versus an older brain. In total, usually, however, the change is minimal, so probably not as extreme as this image here. So also, other neurons are able to change their synaptic connections so that learning may continue as a lifelong process. The destruction of some neurons can be attributed to a buildup of calcium, which affects the movement of the other ions that we need during the action potential. So some symptoms of age-related damage include a decline in reaction time and speed of decision making, along with obviously the most common one that we see is the loss of memory. So, apart from the secondary source investigation that we'll be doing to have a look at the brain in real life, this brings us to the end of the communication syllabus. Well done.